Hey, this is Isa Nakazawa, your host for Transmission Studio, a show featuring the independent artists and community-based organizations that make San Francisco's arts and culture scene what it is today. And today I'm super excited to bring you part 2 of a conversation featuring the work of Chinese Cultural Center here in San Francisco. And today we are sitting down to talk to Hoi Leung, the Deputy Director and Curator at CCC. So stay tuned. Hoi, thank you so much for being on Transmission Studio and joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a joy to be here.
Yes. Just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about it sounds like a dual hybrid role between Deputy Director and Curator at the Chinese Cultural Center.
Yeah, so I work as the Curator and Deputy Director at the Chinese Culture Center, San Francisco. So that means that I work directly with the artists as well as designing projects at CCC that facilitates collaboration between artists and community members. And then the Deputy Director hat is really I think about the organization sustain and health as well.
Amazing. I love that role. I think with Connie, we were just talking about the hybrid roles that are really produce some beautiful thinking from a program design and leadership role, how weaving those is really critical. And I haven't really seen Curator, Deputy Director, so I was oh, I love that. And how did you learn about CCC? What was that introduction point for you?
Yeah, it's really funny because I was in college and I was studying art, studio art and Asian American studies. So I was literally Googling an organization that does Asian American contemporary art. Because I was I need something that's really edgy and really out there and really experimental. And I think CCC was oh, I've never seen anything like that before. I think what the organization is trying to push in terms of the Asian American narrative, I thought was oh my God, it's so edgy and so cool. So I just wanted to join the organization.
Wow, that's beautiful. And in your own words, what would you say are kind of the core guiding principles of CCC's mission and vision?
Yeah, I think, what we do, we always center on place. The way that we work is very place-based, and, we are located in the historic San Francisco Chinatown. So everything we do ties back into the neighborhood. And we really value, artists' autonomy. We are artist advocates. We want to make sure that the arts is valued across different sectors and different roles in the community and society as well. And I always feel we have a knack for, I think, risk-taking. Everything we do has a little bit of we want to put our own spin on it.
Yeah, I can vouch for that. I took a meeting with YY, and now speaking with you and Connie, there's just this shared spirit that I find so exciting, and it doesn't feel, not to say nonprofits have a certain feel, but it does feel, like you said, experimental and contemporary. And so I'm really appreciating that. And how did 41 Ross come about? Speaking of experimental, that feels very exciting to me to have artists in residence.
Yeah, 41 Ross actually started back in 2014.
Oh, okay.
And there was no prototype like that before, because it used to be a tofu shop. So it's a tofu shop called Walchen that's now in Washington. They still make fresh tofu, and it's really great. So when the storefront was vacant, our predecessors were we should do something there. We should have a venue that, brings together artists and community members and really celebrate the culture of Chinatown, and perhaps use art as a vehicle to build community. So that's how 41 Ross was founded. And it was very unprecedented in a sense that it was an arts organization, which was CCC, working with a community development organization, which is CCDC, Chinatown Community Development Center, that, advocates for public housing and also does community development work. So it was, us working together in a collaboration that manifested into space. And now I don't know how many years, 7-8 years of programming. And then the 41 Ross Artists in Residence is sort of another kind of evolution of just that, that beginning point.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I think there's such a important collaboration and partnership in a deep sense between the arts organizations and independent artists and architects and community developers in order to kind of create that generative space of place-based, informed, community-informed social practice and creative practice. Can you tell us a little bit about like more about the residents? Like what's your curatorial approach? How do you find emerging artists? I think Connie's residence was like 3 months. So are they longer residences? Like tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so we started the residency actually after the pandemic, because before there was different formats of programs. And as I mentioned, that was, an experimental storefront space. So we tend not to try to repeat the same thing twice because we feel like we still haven't exhausted all the, I think, community strategies that we can use in that space. And I think in terms of the curatorial approach for identifying artists who could be, community minded, has a sort of knack for community building and also leaning into the idea of social practice. I think it comes from a bit of it is instincts, I would say, just speaking as like, a curator, but also I do apply, like an equity lens and community lens in everything that I do. So just, imagine it like a Venn diagram, then you have like the perfect artist.
Amazing. Yeah, we asked Connie how she got connected to 41 Ross, and you were, of course, the link around initiating a conversation. And so I do think that instinct fits. And so how long are the residencies? Do they vary in length, or like, it feels like the reason I'm asking is because I think artists that I know, including myself, sometimes when the work is so quick, you can't go that deep, especially if it's involving community, right? Like you have to kind of sink in and live in that for a little bit. So I'm kind of curious, like if 3 months, 6 months feels a little more generous.
Yeah, we love the 3-month format, actually. I think anything less than that is a little bit more difficult. Anything longer than that is actually quite burnout. Yeah. And because community is a lot of emotional labor as well. So when we look at the 3-month formats, how we build a team around the artists, we were very intentional about having like public programming or some community collaboration like in the middle of the residency, and then so that it builds even a bigger community, so by the time we have the finale, everybody comes out for it. So it's all of those things combined, and instead of like curating like art objects, you're actually like curating with like people, place, and time, and so the timing aspect is very very intentional in the residency.
And then can you taking a step back, like what's your personal relationship to Chinatown?
Yeah, well, I grew up in the city. I was born in Hong Kong, grew up in the city. Actually, growing up, I rarely go to Chinatown because I live in the Sunset, and I have my grocery stores there. And my mom works at a dim sum shop and everything. So I learned about Chinatown through my work at CCC. So I started as a volunteer, then I joined as staff. So I think I spent around like 6-7 years like spending a lot of time in Chinatown now. I think every time I come here, the layers just keep revealing itself. I think, at the very first impression, and I noticed that during the pandemic time where a lot of like young Asian American were coming to Chinatown, they were soul searching in Chinatown looking for like the dan tat or the egg tart or the milk tea or something like that. And then slowly they would realize like, wait a second, this neighborhood is like really badass, it's so resilient, it's in the frontier of like public housing policies, in the frontier of immigrant rights, and it was, has a lot of great social justice organization too. So eventually I learned about Chinatown's resilience, and that informed the way I curate as well. So I feel like at this point I'm like, Chinatown is, I spend more time in Chinatown than in my neighborhood.
Wow, that's amazing though, because when I moved in 2008 and I lived in the city for 11 years, and I always, as an outsider to California, was fascinated by the duality between like Clement, Sunset, and Chinatown. Because I always feel like Chinatowns have that tourist attraction. Mm-hmm. They're always near Little Italy's. They're always in the downtown across the U.S. And then there's the Sunsets and Clement areas where they're like way further out. It's way more residential. So can you just break that down? Like, what do you notice as, because there's never just one site of Asian Americans. Like, we're always all over the place. What do you think is unique about Chinatown as opposed to Sunset?
Yeah, and it's interesting because Chinatown, when you walk in, right, there's no doubt that you're in Chinatown. So, and I bring this up because right now there's a lot of like, I think, different conversation around like, oh, we need community branding to really make people feel like, they have a sense of place. And I was like, Chinatown did that post 1906 earthquake as a way to like, defend itself, right? Chinatown, put on a costume almost, right? And said like, okay, we're gonna we're gonna lean in on like tourism as an economic engine for this neighborhood, and that we are gonna stay. So I thought that was such an empowering and ingenious move. So for me, it always had that nugget of that story in there. And then of course, during the Chinese exclusion era, Chinese cannot own land or own property. And eventually, after the 65 Immigration Acts, and Chinese people could own property elsewhere in the city, and you see the culture kind of spread throughout. But for Chinatown, it was so ingenious. It was advocacy, activism, and policy. Yeah.
That's such a beautiful answer. Thank you for articulating that. And I think also it does create leveraging, right? Unfortunately, being dispersed geographically, we don't have that power to not just narrativize, but to actually leverage. And I like the idea of the wink of we're in on something that other people aren't even realizing. It doesn't matter because it's not about them. It's our community strategy, yeah. Right? What have you, if for listening who's never been to San Francisco's Chinatown or doesn't have that deep knowledge and tie, what's a story or what's a glimpse that you would want people to know about, or that kind of, I know not one glimpse embodies it, but what's...
Yeah, as someone that, grew up in cities, I love just walking and hearing and seeing and things like that. So I always tell people walk on Kearny, right? Walk on Grant, and then walk on Stockton, and just notice the layers. And it's so apparent. And I think now that with the central subway station that opened in Chinatown on Stockton Street, take the subway there, look at the artwork, look at the murals. It wasn't always like that we have murals that represent the stories of Chinatown, but now there are, you can look at the murals and kind of dive deeper from there.
I love that. And what is the, it's a big question to say the legacy and history, but what is the relationship between the artists and the arts in Chinatown and kind of more economic housing? Because I feel like those sometimes we get beautification or revitalization grants that pit the artist against it's like the bread and roses thing. What's your take on that in terms of how we can often be divided?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because my approach is always, and when I was developing the 41 Ross Artist in Residence program, that let the artists develop and let the community develop as well. And if we kind of look at both sides, there might be tension, and I think those are moments of stretch and growth. And one example I want to bring up is that across from 41 Ross, there's a boba shop, and that boba shop has opened right at, I think, spring 2020. And when we know, afterward, it was the pandemic, Chinatown was so depressing and so empty. But, the boba shop persevered, and we persevered too. So at that time, we're doing a project with Christine Wong Yap called Art, Culture, and Belonging. And so we did storefront art. And I remember we're looking at him, he's looking at us. The whole alleyway was really empty. But the magical part is he's actually such an artist. So if you go to Ross Alley now, there's so many murals, so many plants that were decorated, and he initiated a lot of it. He did a lot of it. So if someone came to me and say, "Oh, I'm gonna give you $5,000 to paint a bunch of murals in Ross Alley," I'd be like, "No, actually it's very prescriptive. I don't like that." But he painted the pandas. He painted the children in with kung fu poses. So I think it's the community aesthetic that I want to value. That I want to uplift. So it's a very it's organic. It's kind of my approach to it. And it does take time, right? Since the opening of 41 Ross 2014, and this unfolded maybe in the last few years, and it takes time. It does take a lot of grits on both sides, and something beautiful like that happens.
It feels like fresh water, hearing you speak, because I do feel it does take time, and I feel like there's all this unexpected, accidental, cultural production that happens when you put the emphasis more on the relationship building and less on the product, right? Because it is prescriptive. And so that just I was fresh water hearing these responses. And then what is it? Yeah. What has it been post-pandemic in terms of audience development, seeing, that's a big word, but seeing people come out to events, does it feel like there's that the Chinatown's being re-energized now?
Yeah, totally. I think, the community is so strong, you know. We have a festival literally every weekend, right? Every week in Chinatown, there's a festival. And people are behind those, right? People work on those. And so I think the people are ready to come back. And also part of what we were doing during the Artists in Residence program is at some point, the buzzword was economic development, right? And at that moment, I was like, Okay, sure. I think we can develop some programs where we pay the business owner directly, try to buy from their product and collaborate with them. And I think the takeaway, in retrospect, is that we were in a way like a morale booster for the business owner, because we were constantly checking in on them. We were kind of giving them like little nuggets of hope and inspiration. When they're like, there's like, oh, business not good, and then we're like, come to this party on Friday. You're invited and bring your stuff. So in so many ways, it was actually like mood. It was like emotions, at the end of the day. And I was like, that's so true. Having artists being that, that conduit to make the other person feel like they're seen, right? They're supported, they're heard and inspired. I think that was something that we couldn't quite calculate the impact, but like it was there. The impact was there. Yeah.
Wow. I really like echo that. I've been thinking a lot about like our most cherished non-renewable resources are like our poems, our songs, our connectivities, and how sometimes even we undermine that when we're like, this is frivolous, like we need, I think that's really, those conversations are very alive right now. And thinking about like in moments of war and moments of accelerated geopolitical, like where we feel like our songs and our poems and our art, that we need to somehow put them down or that they aren't enough. And I think that oftentimes our art is like, not just inspiration, but it's like it's a way of being, and it's a way of like poetry and art can live forever. I was just reading this like line of our words can haunt, they have a life outside of us.
Yeah.
And I think they're the best of us. And so I think that's a really fascinating, qualifying takeaway that you probably could only see retrospectively.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And then so can you tell us a little bit about the artists that you're excited about in Chinatown? Like who are you personally inspired by right now?
Yeah, well, for a long time, I love Bijun Liang's work. Bijun's an artist that grew up in Chinatown, and she makes these like really fun inflatable that kind of, she did one called like Omens in Chinatown. So she asks like, women in Chinatown to like, give an object to her, but then prescribe a wish on top of that object. So she did that back in 2018 at 41 Ross. And some of the things were like, oh, more like less bike lanes, so it's hilarious. But they have like little tints of like urban design, wants, it's like, oh, less like, white people exoticizing us, so stuff like that. So it's super humorous. So I love her work. And then this project that we just did this past year with Christine Wong Yap called How I Keep Looking Up, that brought together 16 working class women from Chinatown and also the Mission District. So it's a trilingual project of Chinese, Spanish, and English. So that project, I still think about it, and every time I think about that project, I like tear up a little bit, because what the women did was they designed these like flags that represents their stories of resilience, and then they, march with the flags during the Lunar New Year parade this past year. So it was like their body and then their stories, they're holding their stories very proudly, and they're walking on the streets, like marching together on the streets. So that's one project that I think about a lot.
That's so beautiful. And I was curious about how language gets negotiated in your work, if there is like a lot of different needs for dialects and for different, like, how do you negotiate language?
Yeah, I think, for CCC and a lot of our staff are also like bilingual and are immigrants as well. So language access and language justice is very central to our work. So whenever we can, we try to have at least 80% plus on like bilingual like materials. And then if you're a community member who only speaks like Cantonese or Mandarin, if you walk up to our reception desk, someone would be able to speak your language. And so it's very, it's so central to who we are that we can't separate it sometimes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I was noticing on the website that some of the artists and residents at 41 Ross are non-Chinese, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Can you speak to the intention of that too?
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we look at the work that we do to facilitate an artist working in community, we look at a few things. So sometimes they are Chinese, but they might not be Chinese speaking. Mm-hmm. And some of the artists that we work with, are international. So they already have like a lot of cultural competency or cultural similarity. Mm-hmm. And there are artists who have, astounding like studio practice, but they might not have a social practice arm. And some artists are like super social practice, but they might not have work in China. So there's always like one or two little variable that we look at when we work with the artists, but it's all intentional because we're simply trying to like explore, the depth of what we can do to do community development and to position different types of artists to feel a relationship with Chinatown, and that for the artists to be community center as well. So we're looking at that stretch very precisely.
I love that. I think that like the fact that you're thinking about that, but also that so many folks are drawn to you speaks to the work that you're doing and the way that you're framing it. And how would you say or characterize San Francisco and your work in terms of partnership across not just like identity, but just, even across art form and medium? Like, do you feel like San Francisco has like a good culture of partnership and collaboration?
Yeah, I think so. And then everything, we do is so collaborative. And, we work a lot within Chinatown with non-arts organization as well. And I think it's always maybe just as an example, during the pandemic, different organizations or community member would call us and like, hey, can you get an artist to do a mural? And then I'll be like, do you have a budget for them? And then they'll be like, no. So for me at that moment, I was like, oh, we actually really need to advocate for the arts and artists and all that. So there is like a point of connection there in terms of like us being with the arts and culture community, working, in parallel with each other, and we're like, yeah, we need to advocate for more funding for artists and the arts. And then of course, cross-sectorally within the neighborhood, outside of the neighborhood, it's really about making sure that, our peers understand how important and essential art is.
I love that. And then from within the artists, do you notice any or observe any like through lines in what artists are looking for? Because I think there's a lot of assumption that artists, working artists especially, want a lot of financial and material support. But what other kind of things are you picking up on them being in need of?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an entire ecosystem. I think financial stability is very important. And then in addition to that, you do need your curators, you do need your, exhibition managers, you do need your, marketing people, and you do need like institution that can provide the infrastructure in terms of like venue. Sometimes artists work in our space and say, oh, this is the largest space that they have ever worked in. And it's like, yes, and we need more spaces like that for you all. And when I work with artists, I do, actively try to develop them, finding out, what they want to do or hope to explore but never got a chance to. So I really try to hone in on those questions when I work with them. So I could only imagine that many artists might need something like that. Funding is important.
Yeah, I love that. And it feels like there is, and I could be wrong, but it feels like there's a kind of an angle or a value system in 41 Bras around supporting youth. And I'm wondering if that's kind of related, right? Because like young people, when we're young, that's kind of when we're forming what's possible for us. And I often feel like there aren't that many choices presented. It's kind of like I need to be in front of the camera, but not really behind it, right? And so that's just an example of like, we don't really get broken down those roles or necessarily encouraged to be a curator, or like the ecosystem isn't always so articulated as young people. So is that part of the mission, like having a lot of youth programming?
Yeah, totally. I think for the 41 Ross Youth Artists in Residence program, we call it Generation Chinatown because like Gen something, so it's like Gen Chinatown, And then for them, I think the ethos behind that project is that we're looking at them first and foremost as artists, and then that artists that happen to be young people. So that is like our like model of that program. So I think a lot of them, in their like kind of exit interviews, they came away with like, oh, I've never been seen as an artist before. Right. So I think just to articulate that, yes, you are an artist, and artist can be a very expanded term or very multifaceted, or, it still serves a lot of different interests that you might have. But I think leaning in on that, like, yes, we support artists is the very first step.
Was that something you received growing up? Like, were you encouraged and kind of seen as an artist who happened to be young? Or is that something you didn't have, so now you really intrinsically understand how important it is?
I went through a youth program. I went through a youth art program.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I was like, wow, that was so transformational. And then so I always had it in me, just like, I need to do something at some point. And so for Generation Chinatown, it was an idea that I had like, I think since like 2018-ish, but we couldn't get like the funding until like very recently. So
I love hearing that though, because I think sometimes we like don't have, it's like we create something we didn't have because we don't want that repetition, right? Of a lack of support. Or it's like, I know deeply I've been like mentored and like supported, which is really beautiful. And can you tell us, unfortunately coming in time, but can you tell us a little bit about current programming and like upcoming exhibits that we can check out?
Yeah, so our gallery is free, and we're open from Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4 p.m. And our current exhibition is called Perilous Playground, because right outside of our front door at CCC is Portsmouth Square, which is a public park where you kind of like you see your auntie and uncle like sunbathing and like playing games and and doing all sorts of things there. So it's a well-loved park. However, it's going to be renovated soon. That includes the removal of the pedestrian bridge that connects the park to the center. So Perilous Playground is an exhibition that kind of looks at that in through different artistic projects that are local as well as international from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore of artists' resistances in real time with urban renewal or gentrification or things like that. But with a little nuanced spin to it because the renovation on Portsmouth Square is very hard-won from Chinatown. But it's still like an ongoing issue of seeing your community change, because it's not gonna happen overnight. It's still, you need to be with it. Actually, it will become part of people's lives. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. I like the nuance there, because I do think, there's a lot of grief with change, regardless of the power dynamics. Well, it's been such a pleasure, Hoi, speaking with you, and I'm so excited for people to connect with CCC's work and check out the gallery. And then how do people stay in touch with you personally?
Yes. So you can, for me personally,
or the org, whatever.
Or I'll say the org first. So. We're at CCC San Francisco on Instagram. Our website is cccsf.us. If you send us an email through the info email, it's likely that you'll find me.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Hoi. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I do. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Transmission Studio, and stay tuned for the next one.